In the U.S., the war is a footnote buried in our history books, casually referred to as the Forgotten War. The Korean War has been brewing since the end of World War II. After dropping nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, U.S. soldiers divided Korea along the 38th parallel into North and South, and designated the area below the 38th parallel as an American occupation zone. When full-scale war broke out in the summer of 1950, Korea became a testing ground for the U.S. to hone the brutal tactics and technologies that they would later unleash on people around the world. The U.S. practiced things like saturation bombing in the South, and in the North designed bombing campaigns to exhaust the population. Within the first 2 years of the war, the U.S. had already destroyed every city, industrial area, and town in the North. So they began bombing irrigation dams, flooding farmlands to cause mass starvation. Along with bombs, the U.S. poured 600,000 tons of napalm over the country. Napalm that would burn through skin, muscle, and bone. It burned so hot it would suck the oxygen out of the air, suffocating everyone within the strike zone. Grace Cho is a historian and wrote extensively about the war in her book, Haunting the Korean Diaspora: Shame, Secrecy, and the Forgotten War.
The summer of 1950 was unusually hot. This is how survivors of the war remember it, regardless of what temperatures actually registered on the thermometer. It was the first hot war of the Cold War, and entire villages were evacuated. Families gathered children and grandparents at a moment's notice and carried sacks of rice and pieces of their homes on their backs. They walked south along paths that would soon be well worn by the millions of displaced persons. They packed up and traveled down the length of the peninsula toward Busan and then northward again, waded across rivers, and watched their children drown, finally to return to earth that had been scorched and to ghostly piles of ashes that had once been homes.
What they didn't know was that the U.S. military had been given, quote, complete authority to stop all civilian traffic in any direction, to place fire on them, including bombing, and strafing fire from low-flying aircraft. There was no difference between Koreans living in the North and those living in the South, so the U.S., unable to distinguish who the enemy was, indiscriminately killed people seeking refuge. One of the most well-known massacres of civilians is the one that took place in Nogunri in 1950. There, U.S. planes gunned down 400 civilian refugees, many of them families with young children.
The heat that summer was particularly memorable for what it did to the flesh that littered the landscape. During the days and weeks after Nogunri, the few survivors returned to the site of the massacre to gather the remains of their family members. Hee-suk was 16 in the summer of 1950. She escaped after witnessing the deaths of her mother, father, sister, and niece. Perhaps it had been the few words in English she called out to the Americans that had prevented them from shooting her. She continued walking southward, dazed, hungry, and encrusted with blood, her white dress turned stiff and brown. She came to the Naktung River, where the American military were selectively allowing refugees to cross the river, but only if they were young and female. People were saying everywhere that GIs did bad things to women. Hee-suk turned around and walked back to Nogunri. It had rained a lot that summer, so where the massacre had taken place, there were pools of stagnant, bloodied water that contained the dead. There she waded through the stench of decomposing corpses and found the body of her father. It seemed that the bones and flesh moved separately. I virtually scooped up the remains of my father, like mucus, with the cup of my bare hands.
Nogunri was just one of 37 massacres documented in the South. There were countless more in the North. The active targeting of civilians is part of what made the war in Korea different from wars the world had seen before. It got so bad that just 1 month in, Colonel Turner Rogers wrote a memo saying,
"Our operations involving the strafing of civilians is sure to receive wide publicity and may cause embarrassment to the U.S. Air Force and U.S. government.
This awareness didn't change the military's practices. Instead, the Pentagon just stopped documenting the bombings of villages and started referring to these villages as, quote, military targets to avoid negative press. 2 years later, officials from China, North Korea, and the U.S. signed an armistice agreement.
We have stopped the shooting.
A temporary ceasefire on armed conflict. But a peace treaty to end the war was never signed. Since then, the ongoing war enabled a buildup of U.S. military bases, weapons, and troops in the South, and the development of a nuclear program in the North. For Korean people, the war unleashed trauma that would be passed on for generations. So for those who experienced the Korean War, the idea that war is something people would call for or invite in, it's unthinkable. In Sangju and Kimcheon, small cities located on opposite sides of the mountain, people have been holding candlelight rallies to protest THAAD every night for over a year. In Kimcheon, a group of moms and kids dance to an upbeat pop song about opposing THAAD. Behind them, even more gather, light each other's candles, and catch up. Shia-yeon has lived in Kimcheon his whole life.
처음에는 이 사드가 뭔가, 사드 자체를 몰랐어요.
At first, people were like, what is that? They didn't know what it was.
빨갱이고 그렇게 얘기를 많이 했어요.
They would say that if you opposed that, you were a North Korean, a sympathizer, a commie. The biggest problem was the media.
언론 왜곡이었어요. 언론 왜곡. 처음에 이제 이 사드가 거론될 당시에
When THAAD was first announced, they said it was to block North Korea.
그러니까 이제 이 고령화된 대한민국이 이거는
So
없으면
people
이게
thought,
없으면
oh, if we don't have this, there won't be anything to block North Korea when they invade.
이게 이제 점차적으로 시간이 지나면서
But
사드의
as
실체가
time
이제
passed, people came to know more about THAAD and began to
많은
oppose
사람들이
it.
이제 반대를 하게 됐는 거죠.
In Kimcheon and the area surrounding the THAAD deployment site, this is people's primary concern, that THAAD was never meant to protect Koreans. Its location in Sangju County means that the system could not intercept missiles targeting Seoul, the area where half of South Korea's population lives. If anything, the U.S. installed the THAAD radar to spy on China. Since it was announced, China began a low-level trade war with South Korea, boycotting Korean products and even Korean pop stars. It's put South Korea in the familiar and uncomfortable position of having to navigate between the interests of two opposing powers. And a big part of the nightly protests has been about asserting that Korean people should determine their own future.
처음에는 일회 할 때도 한 1,500명, 2,000명 가까이 모였었는데 시간이 이제 길어질수록
In the beginning, 1,500, almost 2,000 people would come out every night. But as time went on, it became harder to come out. Last winter, there were about 150 of us who came out every day through the snow and rain. On average, there are 150 people who come out each night. These are the people who are protecting Kimcheon and Korea and the world.
For those 150 people, everything has changed.
주말이 없어졌고 내 개인 시간이 다 없어졌고
There are no more weekends, free time, nights. But on the other hand, I met a lot of people who I feel stick together more than brothers and sisters, than family.
진짜 형제보다 더 끈끈한 정으로서 이제 살아갈 거예요.
We will continue to live together with more Jung. So even more people have concern for each other and take care of each other.
In many ways, it's the community that's formed around opposing THAAD that has made it possible for people to continue protesting. During busy seasons, people take care of each other's farms. Local bakers send bread and rice cakes for people to share at protests. They roast sweet potatoes over makeshift ovens and hand them out on cold nights. Even the kids write letters to the president and draw pictures about stopping THAAD. But the biggest change may be in how people are thinking, not only about THAAD, but about the history they've been taught their whole lives.
우리는 지금까지
Until now, we only received a partial education about the U.S. In writing 미국, the U.S., we use the Chinese character for beautiful for me. We learn from when we were young, kids, that the U.S. is an angel nation that protects our country without asking for anything in return. But having this experience, seeing our land become U.S. military land, the U.S. behaving like everything is about their bottom line, I thought, we really don't know anything about the U.S. So I'd like the American people to move away from this dreamlike thinking, like they believe they're protecting world peace. And if you watch a lot of movies like Superman, it always looks like the U.S. is a country that protects world peace. So they use these movies to make people around the world believe that. Instead of that, I wish they would make cultural works that show the real image of the U.S. People around the world know that the U.S. is not like that. But even today's news, they say the U.S. came here as an invited guest. And they're doing this and that. But we've come to believe that this is a lie. Many people have woken up to the reality of the U.S., and there's still many more people who need to wake up to this. These questions. What if North Korea isn't the enemy? What if the U.S. isn't actually protecting South Korea? What is possible when we let go of these ideas?